Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Barnard virtually. This is Christine Valenza Shin, class of '84, and Associate Director for Advising and Program. Welcome to this week's session on interviewing, best practices to get the job. Welcome back to people who have dropped in for one or two of the other sessions or been catching up with the recordings, and to anyone who's new today, welcome. We'll do our usual check of who might be out there by asking you to say in the questions section. I was going to ask this a little bit later, but we'll get a list now and come back to it. What's the hardest or craziest question you've ever been asked at an interview? And like I said, we'll circle back to this a little bit later and maybe try and answer something. So go ahead and fill that in the question section so I know you're out there and everyone can hear me. It looks like my screen wasn't up for a minute. I hope everyone can see the screen now. Okay, we've got a couple of good candidates, which we will circle back to. Sounds like people are out there, though. Great, okay, let's get started. So today we are going to look, I'd say probably about 2/3 of the session is going to be introducing an overall strategy for interview success that we as a team and I've used with a lot of different students and alumni preparing for interviews. And then we'll go over some tips and etiquette in case it's been a while since you've interviewed. It's good to know what's happening out there in the world of interviewing. And of course, you are welcome at any point to share your knowledge and experience as well, because I actually haven't interviewed for a while. So some of you probably out there have, and it's always good to share the wealth of knowledge that we all have. So let's start with interview strategies. And the way I approach this is with 3 numbers, 2, 3, 5. The 2 fundamental questions that any potential employer is trying to answer during an interview. In other words, what's the purpose of an interview? What are they trying to figure out? 3 key things you want the interviewers to know about you by the time you walk out the door or hang up the phone in the case of phone interviews. And finally, we'll take a look at 5 common questions to prepare for. We sometimes refer to these as the big 5. They are fairly common, or at least variations. And so our experience, if you're prepared for the big 5, quote unquote, you should be able to handle most of the, sort of standard questions that come your way. And we'll talk a little bit about curveballs as well. So let's start with the 2 fundamental questions. And I go over this because I think it's important to keep the big picture in mind. So the 2 things that we focus on, any potential employer wants to know 2 basic things. Can you do the job? Will you be a good fit? And key point, you actually want to know this too. And one of the reasons I emphasize this is because it's interesting. When I first started doing career advising, I was surprised by how many students and alumni, I guess I shouldn't have been surprised, but it did surprise me how many people viewed it as this potential grilling where every weakness and flaw in their resume and work history was going to be brought up. And I'm not naive. I've definitely heard stories, I think they're unusual, of really difficult interviews or interviewers where there does seem to be a goal of exposing all sorts of things, but it's not the norm. And so one of the things that's important to me in interview coaching is that you go in with your own questions, with your own basic information you want to know, which is, will you be able to do the job? and is this place a good fit for you? The people, the atmosphere, etc. The trick here is you don't want to be constantly focusing on this during the interview. While you're in the interview, the answer to these two questions are, I absolutely can do the job, and I absolutely would love to be here and will fit in great. But one thing I encourage everyone to do is, as soon as possible after the interview, when you're alone again, to jot down the positives and negatives. What did you like? Who did you like? What struck you very positively? And were there some negatives? Were there any red flags? And so we're not just looking at the two fundamental questions here, or the fundamental goal of an interview, but we're reminding ourselves that it's a two-way street. And the best interviews, I'm sure I hope some of you have experienced this, are conversations in which both sides are trying to figure out, do we want to work together? Would this be a good fit? Is this going to work out for everyone? And I think if you can remind yourself of that as you're going in and as you're leaving the interview, that can help sort of balance out the power differential that obviously is there in interviews. So next, so examining these a little bit more closely, can you do the job? This is the one where you have a fair amount of control. You can prepare for this. And basically, your strategy is to keep doing what you've been doing from when you sent in your resume, sent in a cover letter, filled out the application. Perhaps there was a phone screen, and this is the next step in the interview process. You're still making that same case. Now you get to do it in person or over the phone. And the second part of this is to remember the storytelling, as we referred to when we looked at cover letters. Show, don't tell. Where are those concrete examples in the form of a story? It can be a very short story, that demonstrate you being able to do this job. So you're picking and choosing examples that will show that you can do the job. I am going to pause here for 1 second. My anxious son in college is checking to make sure we're safe because he heard about bombs. So I'm going to take a second to say, I'm fine. Sorry about that. Great. I hope you all are fine as well. Okay. And then the second part, my little animations went in the wrong order on this. Okay. The second fundamental question, will you be a good fit? This one can be harder because you have less control over the outcome. It's a fairly subjective, checking each other out kind of impression that you're making. But the strategy here is to just be the best version of yourself. You want to be on for the interview. So you're not trying to be somebody different. You're trying to be you, but the best version of you. So for some people, you need to push yourself. You're going to have to be on a little bit more than you're used to, push yourself to be a little outside of your comfort zone, but you don't need to pretend to be someone completely different. You just want to appear confident, as comfortable as you can, given that interviewing can, be fairly nerve-wracking. And you certainly want to let your enthusiasm come through. I think that's really important to communicate that. I think that's one of the most compelling things about candidates, is if they seem excited, interested, enthusiastic, and you obviously want to be as articulate as you can as well. Then the next key part of the strategy, we were looking at 2, 3, 5. The 3 is 3 things about you. And so this is a question when I'm sort of preparing someone for an interview. This is the main thing we spend time on, is what are the 3 things you most want the interviewers to know about you by the time you walk out the door? What's your agenda? Not an agenda in the sense of you've got to get to this no matter what, but an agenda in terms of a fallback. You've got this fallback preparation, so depending on what's asked and how things go, you're able to work in these key important things. And these can vary. I think a number of them will repeat from time to time, but you do want to, as you're preparing for the interview, think about it in terms of this particular job that you're looking for. You look back at the job description, and certainly look over any additional information you've gotten since the time you applied. Try and focus, brainstorm, try and focus on 3. And then one of the key things is to come up with 2 to 4 examples or short stories of that that demonstrate those. The old show, don't tell, as I keep repeating. And then you can do this out loud. You can do it on a piece of paper or on the computer. But before you actually head into the interview, you want to put these 3 keywords or phrases down, maybe a couple of prompts of the different examples you're thinking of as a reminder. You're not going to necessarily look at them. You're not going to look at them while you're answering. You may have a chance to glance before the interview starts, or towards the end of the interview, if they ask you for questions, you could take a peek at your prepared questions and also back at these. But the idea is just to, have these ideas in mind, have some notes written down. And a note here about phone interviews. I also advise people, same thing on a phone interview, to not have copious notes. It's tempting to try and write down everything because they can't see you. But the problem is if you have too many pieces of paper in front of you, you end up shuffling and getting flustered. So this same strategy of having a single piece of paper with the 3 keywords or phrases as a reminder to yourself works really well, whether you're in a phone setting or in person. So how do these 3 key things work during the interview? The idea here is that any question you're asked, take a second and think about whether you could bring in or pivot to one of your 3 key qualities. And one of the reasons I like this preparation technique so much is it kind of makes you interview proof. Again, I don't know how much experience you all have interviewing, but I've certainly been in interviews. One of my earliest interviews when I was still at Barnard was so informal and chatty, and basically the person telling me about the opportunity, that it was hard to get a word in edgewise, and it was hard to sort of answer questions in a formal, prepared way. On the other hand, you can get the other extreme, which is very formal and rigid. This often happens in phone interviews, phone screens, where it's a single person asking the same questions of the various candidates over the phone. I'd say that HR tends to be a little bit more prone towards the formal and planned question, answer, and group interviews can sometimes be this way as well, because often the group has sat down ahead of time and figured out who's going to ask what. And that ends up sort of maybe not planned, but it can be a little bit rigid and inhibit conversation because each person takes their turn. So, and then hopefully interviews are somewhere in between. But regardless of how the interview actually plays out, you have this backup agenda. You have these 3 key things you want to get across. So no matter the format, you're kind of looking for ways to work those in. And that's the sort of key preparation. But let's look at some of these common interview questions as we continue on with our strategy. All right. And here's our version of the big 5. And as I said up front, there are many variations on these. So you may not get the exact wording, but these are fairly common, fairly frequently asked questions. Some of you may have encountered these before. And I'm going to break these down and go over them one by one, give you some strategies for them, and that should help you field most questions like this. So first up is tell us about yourself, which is surprisingly, it's interesting when I ask people when I'm doing interview prep, which one throws you off. This one often can throw people off, especially early in your career, because it could be asking something that it's not necessarily asking what you think. And so the format I'm going to look at with these big 5 is, in other words, we want to take a look at or theorize, what are they actually asking? And when someone asks you this, tell us about yourself, or even more directly, walk us through your resume, what they really mean is walk us through the highlights of your resume. So The key here is, I'll skip down to the don'ts. You don't want to go through the entire resume point by point, nor do you need to tell your whole life story. When they say tell us about yourself, that doesn't necessarily mean tell us about your personal qualities, your childhood. In fact, really what it means is tell us about your professional self, or tell us the most relevant things we need to know about your professional self. Doesn't mean you cannot work in a few biographical details. It doesn't mean you can't talk about some personal qualities. But overall, you're trying to approach this from a professional standpoint. So the basic idea here is to highlight recent and relevant work history and activities. And recent is interpreted in different ways. I know we've got some young alumni, fairly recent grads participating in this series, and so you may want to start with Barnard. Lots of you may want to start with Barnard, and then tell sort of the brief story of where you've been since then, and then focus in on your most recent or most relevant work. Another common thing is to start with your most recent work and kind of go backwards, and then flip to the end. So there's various ways of doing it. You want to approach it in a somewhat planned and organized way. And one thing I sometimes work with people is this is a good opportunity to choose one or two of your three key qualities as a focal point. So instead of making the chronological framework the center of it, you could say, they say, tell us about yourself. You say, well, the number one thing to know about me is that I am a problem solver. And I first figured this out about myself in Barnard when I chose X major. So you could go back to Barnard, or you could start with your more recent work, and then you could sort of use that theme of being a problem solver to discuss and describe some of your recent and relevant history. And when I say, just to finish up this last bullet point, there's no rules about following strict chronological or reverse chronological order. It is relatively common for people to start with their current or most recent work and move backwards if that makes the most sense. But as I said, you could talk about where you're at now and then circle back to what got you there. There's a variety of ways. Just think about it, try and outline it a little in advance how you're going to answer this basic introductory question, and try and stick to that. It's a helpful framework. Okay. Another very common question, why do you want to work for this organization? Why this job? Why us? It has a lot of different variations. And what they're really asking is, what do you know about us? What do you know about this role? It's sort of a check to make sure that you understand who they are, what makes them different, what makes them unique, and you get what job you're applying for, what team you're looking to join. They want to know that you've done some research, that you have a sense of what you're getting into, and this is how they test for it. And so there's big picture things like what's their overall mission and how are they viewed within the industry? Are they a big player, a new on the scene, a disruptor, a innovator, old school? Where are they? Are they regional, looking to become more national? Are they teeny tiny and that's just fine? That's where they're staying. So it's just sort of looking at this, overall place. And then generally, you want their general reputation and work atmosphere. Again, you don't necessarily want to share anything negative on that score, but it's helpful to know and to demonstrate that if this is a place with, open workspaces or, just various other, a particular work culture. Right? And then what you always want to do at the end of this question, though, is bring it back to you and what you're going to bring to them and your desire to be part of that mission and part of that team. Okay. Just a reminder, as we're talking about questions, that if you have any questions as we go along, you can ask them. I'll keep an eye on it, or definitely get into it at the end. Another classic question, what are your greatest strengths? What will make you good at this job? Why are you a good fit for this? It's sort of going for the positives. And this one's relatively straightforward. They basically are asking you to talk about what makes you a good match for the job, which you have been hopefully thinking about and talking about already in your cover letter, in the interview in general. And this is an excellent place to work in 2 or 3 of your key qualities. And you do want to think back on the job description. And there's a couple of approaches. You could focus in on things you've already mentioned in your cover letter, or you could, this could be an opportunity to expand on some other things in the job description that you didn't mention before. So there's different ways to do it, but you just want to sort of base it on, it's sort of that same concept we looked at back when we were looking at targeting your resume, targeting your cover letter, which is this: what is your sense of what they're looking for, what's important to them, and how do you match up with that? How do your experiences and skills match up with that? Okay. And then of all the questions, when I ask people, what's a question you struggle with? This is probably the most common one to struggle with, is what do you do with this question? What are your greatest weaknesses? I think the key here is, what are they really asking? Do they really want to know your weaknesses? Do they really want to know you're a procrastinator, or that you're not good at getting along with people who are obsessed with details, or that you have a tendency to miss the big picture yourself, right? They don't really want to know that. And part of the reasons this question gets tricky is you want to choose weaknesses that aren't fundamental to the job, even if maybe you have them. But what they're really getting at is, are you self-aware? Can you change your behavior as needed? So they're really asking for a story or stories about how you've dealt with what I believe we all have, which is sort of wired in flaws, or wired in ways in which we get in our own way. And by wired in, it could be nature, could be nurture, what we can debate the percentages of it, but it's basically taking a look at yourself and saying, what do I do that trips myself up? And how do I work around that? And I think all of us have these and do that. We've all learned to sort of deal with, our tendencies, our negative tendencies, and work around them. And I think that's a legitimate way to approach this one. So specifically, the way I tend to coach around this is to change the language to challenge and use the past tense. Using the past tense does not necessarily mean the weakness has gone away and will never bother you again. You're telling this story of how you became aware of this and what you've done to change your behavior since becoming aware of it. So in the example, in my first management position, delegating tasks was a real challenge for me. So you're sort of comfortably seeing it in the past, that could be the recent past, it could be long ago. And you're picking something, delegating tasks, which is actually a fairly common challenge for a lot of managers, especially women, not exclusively women, but delegating can be difficult. So you're picking a real, a real challenge. And then you want to talk about how you became aware of the problem and how you have worked to fix it, how you still work to fix it. And it's fine if you became aware of it. It could be that you figured it out on your own. It could be that you got some feedback from boss, or pushback from a customer or vendor or other stakeholder. There's a variety of ways in which we become aware of our weaknesses. And again, you want to sort of tell the story. And again, this came up when I was talking to someone recently. It's not like you're trying to pretend that it's magically gone away, but you are basically saying, this is a tendency or a problem of mine. This is how I became aware of it. This is how I've dealt with it. And the implication is, it's not a huge issue. I've changed my behavior to make sure this doesn't get in the way. Okay. So it's helpful to brainstorm genuine weaknesses and then kind of go through them and pick out the ones that are kind of workable in this way, where you can genuinely tell a story of how you work around them and how you've worked to improve them. Right? Okay, and then let's move on to the final big 5, which is what are often called situational questions, which is tell us about a time when, and then they fill in the blank, when you had trouble working with the team, or basically there's sort of negative versions of this and positive versions. We'll look at both. And the key thing here again is they're not looking to find out terrible things about you, but they're trying to figure out how well you handle problems and obstacles, right? This is another opportunity to work in one or more of your key qualities. If you, to go back to the earlier example, if you say you're a problem solver, that's one of your key qualities, then this is a great question to demonstrate that on. And again, you want to have these examples. And it could be the typical versions of this. Sometimes they ask you about working with difficult people. How do you handle a change in deadline or other unexpected developments? When I worked in alumni affairs and whenever we were interviewing someone for an event manager position, we would ask them, our version of this was, tell us about a time an event went awry. Because big or small, something always goes wrong when you're planning an event. And we were curious to hear those stories, but more, it's partly it's the story, and mostly we want to hear what happened, how did you handle it, right? Yeah, and so basically you want to tell a story. And then I added this slide a couple times ago because I noticed that I was starting to hear from people in advising sessions that a lot of times they were being asked questions more about positive situations, and it was throwing them off a little. So they had sort of prepared for negative examples and how you conquered them, but not necessarily positive ones. So so sometimes they will ask things like, tell us about a time you took initiative or were asked to take on something extra, or you suggested an improvement. Some of the things we were talking about back when we were looking at achievement bullets on resumes. And so you need to be ready for these as well. You have to have good positive examples. It's another opportunity to work in some of your key qualities and some of these stories that you might have been brainstorming. Okay. And there's different acronyms for this, but this is one of the simpler ones, which I think is effective. So there's the CAR method of answering this type of situational question, which is context, action, and results. I think it boils it down simply. You want to briefly describe the circumstances. So it's important when you're in storytelling mode not to get bogged down in the wrong part of the story. So you just want to give enough context so that they understand what's happening, what the situation was that you're going to describe. And then you want to get right into actions, right? What did you do specifically to resolve the problem? So context sort of describes the problem, describes the situation, action describes what you did, and then probably even more importantly is what came out of that. What did you learn? What did you or your team learn? What changed because of this experience? So again, when you're thinking of these, you want to try and pick experiences where you can tell a story like this, where something happened. It doesn't have to be a huge catastrophe, but something went wrong or something went right. Again, doesn't have to be earth-shaking, but just an example of where you're the star. And again, it doesn't mean you have to be the person who is in charge of all this, but if you were part of the team, part of the situation, describe your role, describe what you did, and then talk about the bigger picture of what happened as a result. Okay, so that's the end of the strategic part of it. Again, recapping 2, 3, 5. We looked at 2 fundamental questions, 3 key qualities that you're trying to bring out in the interview, and 5 common questions to prepare for. And then I want to take a few minutes to go over some tips and etiquette, things that some things that are time-honored, some things that are new as the world of work changes around us. And then we'll have some time for questions. So just the concept of interview mode. You just want to think about, as you begin networking, sending, and applying for things, you want to do a quick check to make sure that all the representations of yourself that are accessible are professional. Voicemail, I know, phone calls are becoming less and less common, but sometimes people will call you, so you need to check whether it's a landline or your mobile, whatever number you've given out. You want to check your voicemail greeting and make sure that it is clear and short and to the point. So if you've had something more geared towards the personal and entertaining friends and family when they call, you want to shift that over when you're in job seeking mode. Email address, 2 things here. sometimes people have an inadvertently odd email address. The example I love to give is an alumna I worked with a couple of years ago who was of Eastern European origin, and she had decided to use as her um, as part of her email, her family's affectionate nickname for her, which was Booby. So it was some variation on that, and it was like, yeah, no, you do not want that in an email. As sweet as that is, let's make a new one, first name, last name, or some variation thereof, and avoid that. So so if you haven't changed your email in a long time, or if you only have a personal email, or only have if you only have a personal email that's very customized, or a work email which you don't want to be using while you're currently job searching, think about a third email that's professional. And a word here about one of these sneaky little ageism things is that having an AOL email, if that's even possible still, even Yahoo is kind of sort of faded in popularity, sometimes can date you. The other thing I noticed during my years away from the world of work, I was home full time with my son for 7 years. One thing I noticed in sort of the PTA moms world was that a lot of people, when they first got email, used a joint email, so Pat and Mike at whatever. So again, this is a good moment if you, especially those of you who've been out of the workforce for a while, to take a critical look at your email address, make sure it's not dating you. I'd say, Google has conquered the world. Almost everyone has a Gmail address. Most people use a Gmail that uses some combination of their first name, last name, various initials, that type of thing. And you can't go wrong with that. You don't have to conform to that, but you can't go wrong with that. Social media, we're all everywhere, even those of us trying to, I know there's some of you out there who try and limit your social media for a variety of reasons, but everyone is Googleable. Not a whole bunch might come up, and that's fine, but it's always useful to Google yourself, see what comes up, and adjust privacy settings where possible. So I know things like on Facebook, you can, go, if you haven't before, go in and limit during your job search and maybe beyond who can see photos and who can see if somebody else posts a photo of you. There's all sorts of privacy settings there, and so you might want to explore some of those if things are popping up on a Google search that you don't want to be the first thing that a potential employer sees about you. Okay. All right. I think we have a question. Okay. I'd say even Hotmail dates us. Yeah, I think it's true. It really Google Mail, Gmail has taken over the world. So, there's other sort of quirkier things out there that as long as they're sort of new and edgy, it's better than old and stale. So, good point about Hotmail. Okay. All right. Couple of research tips. You want to, this goes to, we were talking earlier about that big question, why do you want to work for us? Take just some additional resources that you might know about and have forgotten or might not have heard about. You definitely want to look at the company website, and pretty thoroughly, because not only is there a lot of information there, but you get a lot of information about how they view themselves, how they are branding themselves and projecting themselves to the world, and that's important that you're able to reflect that back to them, not word for word, and you don't want to stay on that sort of big picture level completely, but you want to have some sense of how they see themselves in the world and what they're focusing on. There's company profiles on LinkedIn that can be very useful. Glassdoor.com, I might have mentioned before, is a website where people are encouraged to share interview questions, interview experiences, salary information, as well as just general information. You want, as with any other kind of sharing site, rating site, you want to take things with a grain of salt. You want to look at how many reviews there are, and if there's just a handful and they're all negative, you don't need to discount that completely, but it could be people who were fired, or so if there's just a small sample. But if there's a relatively large sample of recent reviews that are mentioning some of the same things, again, it doesn't mean you can't work at the company, but it's just helpful to know that going in, and it could be on your list of things to sort of try and get a feel for. some things can be very specific to a particular team or department. So again, you just, you want to look at this critically, but it can convey some interesting information. And then again, Google, all powerful. You do want to do a search, Google or otherwise, to see if there's any media coverage, positive or negative or in between, just to know. And again, you don't have to work in every detail of this, but it just helps you sort of be coming from a place of knowledge about where you're interviewing with. And again, if you haven't looked at the job description for a while, pull it up. It's not a Bible. It may have changed. It may have the person who wrote it may not be the person who's interviewing you, so you don't have to be married to it, but it's helpful to go back over what they're looking for. And then depending on the title, you can go to ONET, which I may or may not have mentioned before. It's a website run by the Department of Labor, and you can type in a job title and it gives an overall description. And that can be helpful too, to see sort of the context within it. Again, some job titles really vary from place to place, but it can be helpful to sort of take a bigger picture look. Okay. A couple of preparation tips. I think one of the things that people are sometimes surprised about, especially some of our more recent grads, is you can get details in advance. So if they tell you you're coming in if they ask you to come in for 3 hours, or to save 3 hours for the interview or half an hour or whatever they tell you, even if it's setting up a phone screen, you absolutely can ask how long can I expect and who will I be speaking to. If they say you're going to be speaking to 4 different people, is that going to be one after the other? Is that going to be in a group? So you're certainly entitled to ask, and I would say any company that's not forthcoming about that's a little bit of a red flag. Again, you could still go to the interview, but if a company's uncomfortable sharing that information, then I would think that's kind of a bad controlling sign. But generally, you can absolutely ask, and you'll often get some valuable information. I changed this bullet to consider looking up the people you'll be interviewing with. You certainly could look at them on the company's website. LinkedIn, the question people ask me is, well, won't they be able to see that I looked at their profile? Maybe they have that feature on, have a premium account and can do that. Maybe they will. It's possible. Most people won't think badly of that, but if you're not comfortable with it, you don't need to do that. But it can be helpful. And then you just want to be, you're not looking people up so that you can creepily refer to their favorite hobbies or whatever, but it certainly is okay to let them know that you saw a post that they wrote or something else public, or you can just do this simply for your own knowledge, so you have a little bit better sense of who's in the room with you. So you mentioned Glassdoor. Again, people will share interview questions. The specific company or division might not be up there, but you can look at similar things. So I've been doing some grad school prep, interview prep with alumni recently, and it's amazing what's out there in terms of specific business schools, law schools. People share a lot of information about that. And again, your interviewer might not ask those precise questions, but it's always helpful to, get a little preview, get a little sense of what you might want to prepare for. And then, as I did at the start, it's always helpful to throw that out there. I do this on Facebook every once in a while. I'll just ask people to tell me the oddest, hardest interview questions they've ever been asked. So, so I'm just going to pop back up to the top, see if anybody answered this one. Sherry asked about the biggest flaw. Excellent. We already talked about that, so hopefully that was helpful. And oh, great. Okay. And on a different matter, Lisa weighs in and says, as a hiring manager, I take it as a good sign when a candidate has looked me up on LinkedIn. So a lot of people do view that really positively as you being proactive and using information. So don't be afraid to do that if it feels like a good idea to you. Okay. Anybody else want to throw out a hard or odd question they've been asked, and we can circle back at the end? Okay. I sometimes get asked questions about what to wear. I just always want to, point out that you want to pick something that you feel comfortable in, makes you feel good. I mean, obviously you don't take that to an extreme. It needs to look good, but do think twice about that suit that makes you really uncomfortable, or the blouse, or something that's too tight. Do think about, especially if you're in the middle of a job search, think about investing in something new and comfortable to wear that really makes you feel good. You don't want to be sort of preoccupied with your clothing while you're there. And then again, in today's professional landscape, there's a tremendous variety of dress codes. So the rule of thumb is to see if you can find out what the everyday norm for the company is and go a step above that. So how do you find out that everyday norm? Again, Glassdoor, looking at their website, what photos do they have up, or if you have any contacts there, you know, sort of you've done any sort of informational interviews and have a sense of what this company or companies like it are like in terms of clothing. It's always good to bring a Padfolio or a nice folder. You don't often get asked anymore for a copy of your resume, but it's never a bad thing to have on hand. On the other hand, resume paper is super expensive. So if you're in the Barnard neighborhood, we have free resume paper that you can use our printers here if you would like to partake of that. And then for you, you want to tuck in your 3 key qualities and come up with some of your stories that go along with that and questions for the interviewers, anything that you've prepared in advance. Okay. Couple tips around the interview itself. When you do that buffer time to make sure you're on time, just make sure that you're not actually checking in at the actual location until 10 to 15 minutes. So you certainly absolutely can get to the neighborhood early, hang out in a Starbucks or the lobby, but presenting yourself super early for an interview can be difficult. It can cause a bad impression because, or even just cause them a little bit of stress because they may have a very tight schedule. It may throw them off, you know, they may not be ready for you, and then they end up feeling awkward. So get to the area early and check in 10 to 15 minutes prior. Always say yes if they offer you water, because you never know. It's a good staller, you know, a couple of seconds to take a sip of water can give you a few minutes, you know, a few seconds to think and prepare yourself. And then if, you know, generally if you're feeling nervous, you can get the whole dry mouth thing going on. So say yes to water. Try not to knock it down. If you're anything like me, you talk with your hands. So, you know, just keep that in mind. And it is okay in the middle of the interview, if you're really not sure what an interviewer is asking, you can ask for clarification, or you could say things like, well, if you mean this, my answer would be this. Is that what you're looking for? You know, so. Okay. All right, just a few things on body language. When I do this workshop in person, we go around and practice handshakes. You want a firm but not bone-crushing handshake. Again, I'll make a gender generalization that more men do the bone crushing thing than women, but I did have an alumna the other day. I walked out and greeted her when she came for counseling, and I was like, whoa, she really squeezed hard. But even more common is the wimpy handshake. I think women are more prone to that, where your hand is like a dead fish in the other person's hand. Also doesn't make a good impression. So it's hard to demonstrate, not in person, but if you take a look at your hand and look at the web between your index. One tip on handshakes is try and go web to web. So as you reach out, try and get that web on you to match up with the web on the other person. And that kind of keeps you from being wimpy and limpy, but also keeps you from squeezing too hard. So that's what you're looking for. And, you know, is it a huge deal? It is often part of that first impression when someone's meeting you. So it's worth taking a few seconds to think about. Eye contact is important. Not everybody, I know some of you are probably more comfortable with eye contact than others, but if you know you have that tendency to sort of look away, do force yourself out of your comfort zone and make sure you don't have to stare at somebody intently, but at least as you start a question or end a question, you want to make that eye contact with the person or people in the room. Be conscious of your posture, leaning in sometimes as you answer. Some of us do that naturally, but it's not a bad thing to sort of remind yourself to do. It shows enthusiasm and engagement. If it's the day before your interview, the day before your interview is not the time to get rid of your tendency to say but if you've got a couple of weeks or you're sort of in a job search and don't have any interviews yet, never hurts to think about what those verbal tics are. You could record yourself, ask your family or friends, what do I do that's annoying when I talk? And start working on trying to eliminate those. Again, not a huge deal, but something to think about. Okay. All right, we're at the 45-minute mark, so I'm going to zoom through the last couple of slides and then circle back for some questions. The number one thing, I feel like Barnard women wouldn't do this, but every once in a while we get someone interviewing here and we say, do you have any questions? And they say no. It's a huge black mark against any candidate if you have no questions at the end of the interview. So prepare a few, and if possible, think of a few as you go along, because that shows, again, engagement and ability to sort of, roll with the punches. The first one is one of my favorite questions to ask. I didn't come up with it. I saw it on a site somewhere. I forget where. But it's a great question. If I were to be offered the position, what would you like to see me accomplish within the first 3 months, or you could say 6 months, or a period of time? It's good on a couple levels. It actually, psychologically, it makes them picture you in the job, which is helpful since you're interviewing. And also their ability to answer or not answer this will tell you something about who you're going to work for, who you're going to work with. Is they should have a sense of what's important in the position and what they would want the person to accomplish, or what's sort of pressing. So, and a couple of other suggestions there. I'm sure a lot of you have good questions that you ask. You want to, there's a lot of, if you Google this, what are good questions to ask at an interview, there's a lot of information out there. You probably want to, one key piece of advice is don't ask something that is evident from the website, or has already been sort of discussed. You don't want to ask questions that you already know the answer to. You do want to approach this genuinely. What do you actually want to know in order to make up your mind? Should you get offered this job, what do you need to know before you say yes? So that's a useful way of thinking about this. What are your actual, sort of questions? And then, as I mentioned, organic questions that come up during the interview is helpful to be thinking about those as well. Thank you notes, you need to send them within 24 hours of the interview, and you should send notes to everyone who interviewed you. So even with a big group, we do a thing here very often where we have people do a sample presentation to the whole team, which, depending on who joins in, can be up to 8 or 10 people. So I know that's a pain, but it really does stand out. And we did have an opening recently where there were 2 candidates, and one sent a single thank you note to our 2 directors, and the other sent an individual thank you email to everyone. It was not the key thing, but the latter person did end up getting the job. So it was like one of those sort of check marks in the pro column that kind of attention to detail and effort, can pay off. So, but if you do that, do make sure that you get the name right, you spell it correctly. So it's always great to ask for business cards. You could ask them directly of the people you interview with, or you could check with the receptionist, or you can call up afterwards for that information. Email has become accepted and expected, to the point where it's interesting. Even a few years ago, I said, a handwritten thank you note can still make a good impression. That's probably true, but that's becoming so uncommon that it might, in some circumstances, even be considered kind of weird or old-fashioned. So you kind of have to gauge your business and your field and your company. I do have a friend who, what she would do was pre-address the thank you notes and stamp them and bring them with her. And she would go to the interview, and then she would go to a Starbucks or wherever, sit down, write the thank you notes while she was right in the neighborhood, and drop them in a mailbox or post office in the neighborhood, thereby getting a handwritten note to them the next day. If you're in New York City, I think that would probably work in most places. If you actually put it in the mail very close to the physical organization. So I thought that was an interesting variation on the, because email, of course, allows for a much faster turnover generally. So, but yeah, handwritten thank you notes are a bit, I feel like I haven't gotten one in a year or 2. And we've been doing a fair amount of interviewing over the years for openings here. So I feel like they really are fading. To me, they don't make a huge impression either way. I don't think they're weird. I don't think they're, the most amazing. It's not personally super important to me that it be handwritten, but just know that it's fine to do thank you notes by email. It's not weird anymore. Okay. All right. So, I'll go ahead and finish up, and then go back for questions for anybody who wants to stay. So just as usual, our next steps, we've only got 2 webinars left. So if either of these topics are of interest to you, negotiating the job offer, that includes salary and other benefits, we'll take a look at that, and possibly even do trying to figure out how to make that interactive over a webinar. Any thoughts you have on that would be helpful. Feel free to email me. And then finally, we'll wrap up with a session on a positive session on you've got the job, now what? How can you keep an eye on your ongoing professional development in the long term? Advising appointments are available as always. Some of you have been taking advantage. It's been fun to get to meet you individually. You can go online to handshake, or you can call the office to make an appointment. All right, we've been pretty busy lately, but so it can sometimes take a little bit of. We are here. So, questions. Let's take a look and see. Oh, good. I have a bunch of questions. Let's take a look. Oh, okay. Sorry. One thing I don't love about GoToWebinar is their question feature. Okay, good. So this was Lisa's point that she takes it as a good sign. That's where we left off. Okay. Hard question. Tell about a time that you had a conflict with leadership. I tend to think of big systemic things that no one could possibly have solved versus sticking with a nice story that has a happy ending. Oh, interesting. So I tend to think of big systemic things that no one could possibly have solved versus sticking with a nice story. Yeah, maybe somewhere in between. That conflict with leadership is tough. That's a tough question because you really don't ever want to be in an interview and criticizing leadership of your company, of your current or former company or your manager, because very often you are being interviewed by your future manager, and it's a rare manager who wants to hear that you didn't get along with your old manager. On the other hand, everybody knows that these things happen. So you have to approach these leadership questions very carefully. I think in some cases what you're saying, that sort of systemic thing, could be a way to go and say, you know, I really struggled with my company's system for doing this, and here's why. And again, I wouldn't focus in on like personnel things, but more, you know, things that are very germane to the work, you know, and then talk a little. You tried to push back, and where you were able to have some success and where you weren't, you know, that's not a bad thing. I think sometimes where they're looking for here is, you know, how do you handle the fact that you have a boss and that there's a hierarchical structure, and how do you work within that? Sometimes it can come up in the form of, you know, if you were asked to do something that you considered unethical or unprofessional, how would you handle it, you know? And again, that can be tricky as well, but try and be genuine, try and give real life examples where you can. And if you haven't had that particular dilemma, it's okay to say that as well, and say, you know, I luckily haven't had the experience of a really bad boss. If I did, you could do either a hypothetical. If I did have, you know, this is the kind of boss who probably would drive me crazy. Try and pick something, I don't know, relatively. Try and pick something that, I don't know, that can be tricky too. This is I think one of the trickier sets of questions. So worth some thought, and definitely worth some, you know, one-on-one conversation with myself if you want some help anticipating these. But yeah, I think that, you know, being again honest about what you did to try and solve the problem, solve the situation, and where you sort of backed off, you know, because you know, we all do tend to work in hierarchies, and that's part of the reality. Is sometimes you can push back, sometimes you can't. Okay, all right. Yeah, and actually that brings. I just want to say one more thing. Not all of these examples, all these stories have to have a happy ending. You know, you can be honest about the fact that, you know, this thing happened, and we tried to solve it, and we were able to do this, but ultimately we weren't able to do that. And I think that's fine as well. I think being able to sort of assess the situation and sort of even just step back and evaluate it that way, and evaluate it honestly, is a good quality. So, okay. I've always felt that a suit is right for an interview, but I never wear one normally, and have never had a job where they were expected. Yeah, that's I think that, you know, generally you can't go wrong with a suit, except, well, for general, you know, sort of you know, small to medium, I'd say medium to large corporations, medium to large nonprofits. You know, you can't, there's nothing wrong with a suit. Where it can come off as inappropriate is in a very casual workplace. So where, you know, if we're talking about, you know, anywhere from big to medium to small tech, where there is a very casual dress code, coming in a suit can seem sort of too formal. But you don't want to necessarily come in jeans and t-shirts either. It's generally, the general rule is to go up a step. So in a situation like that, you might want to be business casual, business formal, somewhere in there. So. Okay, and just to clarify, Sherry went on to say, meaning I never wear one at a job itself, but I've always worn it for interviews. So again, I think it's fine to wear a suit to an interview, and even suits. There are some that are more formal, some that are less formal. You know, you could, for instance, even for a highly informal workplace, wear a suit, but maybe jazz it up a little, you know, like wear a bright color underneath or an interesting accessory, you know, that sort of shows a funkier side or a more casual side, you know, something, you know, you can sort of, there's a lot of different nuanced ways you can approach that. Okay. Is it inappropriate in an interview to take handwritten notes? That's an interesting question. I wouldn't do it excessively. You probably could, if there was some key thing that came up that you wanted to write down, you can say, oh, you know, that's a great question, or that's a really interesting thing. Let me just jot that down. But I would avoid taking notes unless you know, it could be, you could maybe do it once or twice during the interview, but certainly not constantly. And then again, my suggestion is as soon as you are away, you know, as soon as you're back on your own, you certainly could sit down and then jot down some notes, you know, and things that you want to recall. So, but if you're doing things like taking down something, if you're, let's say you're checking with the receptionist as you leave on the spelling of the names of the people you met with, then that's of course fine to take notes there. Okay. God, this is so, sorry. I get so frustrated with this question function. It's really hard to see them. I hope I'm not skipping anybody's. How do you feel about a dress with a jacket? Industry dependent. I think that's a great look. Again, a dress, you know, there's a lot of variations on that. So you want to, again, look at the website, see if you can get any sort of inside scoop from Glassdoor or from a person, you know, on what the prevailing thing there is. But I think that that's a nice variation of, you know, and that can be a very formal look, or it can be a slightly less formal look. So I'm open to that. Okay, sorry. Okay. What if you don't have any further questions for an organization, but the interviewer keeps pressing for what more can we tell you about the company? You could try and turn it back on them and say, there's a couple variations. You could say, well, what have I missed? You know, like what, is there something sort of specific about your company that you think I should know? You know, another one is to say, what are people surprised about when they start working here, or what's something you know, what might surprise me when I start working here, you know? So I would say if they're being that persistent, that there may be something they want to tell you, or they may be trying to sell you on the job, you know. But so I think if you're pressed for more, I mean, you certainly could try and come up with one or two more things, and then if they're continuing to press you, first of all, a little bit of a red flag, and second of all, say, no, you've been great. You've really answered my questions. I think you've answered my questions for now, but I'll be sure to follow up if I have any further. So, and hopefully that would bring it to an end. Okay. Separate question. My last job was very full-time plus, and I'm hoping my next job will not require so many extra hours. What's a good way to ask about that that doesn't seem like you are not a hard worker? Thinking something like, what might a typical day look like, or what does a day look like during a busy period? That typical day, that's a fairly typical question. That's not a bad one, but I like even better. What does a day look like during a busy period for the company? I think that's a great test for it. And then some specific things you can ask is just to say, what's the expectation? Are most people checking email at night or over the weekends? What's the expectation for being available during busy periods? You know, sort of think about the things that kind of either drove you crazy at the old job or did make it burdensome, and think about how to ask that in a neutral way. So saying something like, what's the expectation? What's the norm? You know, and I think that comes off not as being not a hard worker, but simply that you're trying to assess, you know, what's the reality here. And I think especially when you ask about a busy period, what I like about that is you're anticipating that, and you're conveying that I get it, there's busy times, but how busy are we talking, you know, and what are the expectations around that? So I think that's a good one to work from. Okay, and I think I've caught up. All right. So the last one I see is the dress with the jacket. So great, we're a little bit over time. Thanks for hanging in, those of you who are still here, and feel free to follow up by email as well. And I hope to see you at our next session, see quote unquote, or talk to you in person at some point or over the phone. Okay, thanks so much.